the sound of the Tibetan gong, which is making the sound Om, appropriately meaning the beginning. Accepting the premise that there is far more that we don't know about than that we do know about, the West has for centuries been fascinated by the East, by its mysticism, by its apparent access to truths that we can hardly understand, and by its secrets. Nowhere in the world are there traditionally more secrets than Tibet, and consequently nowhere in the world is more fascinating. Dr. Alan Presenza is an international authority on Tibetan culture and Tibetan artifacts. He has a unique collection of singing bowls from that part of the world, which he is going to demonstrate. Colin Wilson, the leading writer on the occult, is here listening to the instruments with me, and we will be talking about these sounds and the mystical importance of them. Firstly, let me turn to you, Dr. Presenza, and ask you to begin by describing the bowl you now have in your hand.
Well, Eric, what I have in my hand is a bowl no more than 3 or 4 inches across. It's made of an alloy of gold, silver, copper, brass, bronze, tin, lead, and iron. It's extremely heavy. It weighs about 5 pounds, and it looks very plain. It looks like a little Victorian hand basin.
Yes.
I hold it in my hands when I play it with the tips of my fingers and the base of my thumb. I hold it on its side, and I then take a small stick of hardwood, and then by placing it on the rim, I move it around and around and around until a sound appears. As soon as the sound appears, I then allow the sound to build.
Well, let's hear that sound now. You hold that bowl close to your mouth, and at the same time you open and close your mouth as if you're speaking. Does that have an effect on the sound that comes from the bowl?
Yes. This is the ululation. The Tibetan idea is that the Lama, and only a Lama is allowed to use these bowls, he takes the bowl and the sound, the holy sound from the bowl, goes into his body, supposedly circulates around his body, and comes out. And the sound that you hear in duet with the bowl that we're playing is presumably that much more holy.
When were these bowls used? I mean, are they still used at present day?
No, they're not. To my knowledge, they're not used at all, and they haven't been used for some centuries. All of them were used in necromantic magical rites.
Ritual.
Yes. I haven't discovered every cause for their use. In fact, the bowls are a product of the Burnpo. And the Burnpo, or the Bon, as they're commonly called, are the pre-Buddhist nature worshippers, a culture that existed and practiced magic, human sacrifice, and perhaps cannibalism, pre-7th century Tibet. Now, that does not mean to say that these bowls are of that age, but certainly the Bon were practicing in Tibet right up until the modern day alongside the Buddhists. I'd like to demonstrate one other thing with this particular bowl, and that's just the beautiful sound it makes. Now, remember when I mentioned about we were just talking about the ululation. Now listen.
Colin Wilson, how did that affect you? Did you get the same effect that I did?
For a moment I thought the BBC were making peculiar noises with their whistling equipment. I can't understand how a sound like that comes out of a very small, golden bowl.
Yes,
not
perhaps
one
we should just
6
mention
inches
it's... Well, no, it's only about 3 3/4 inches across. What would you like me to play for you next?
Well, there's a very large bowl, which I see, in a rather dull...
I want to save that till last. Eric, I'd like to save that.
Let me choose, shall we say, the smaller bowl.
This is the one that I think that gets very close to the pain threshold. This is a bowl that's used specifically for exorcising demons.
Yeah.
Now, I think rather than talk about it, I'll just demonstrate this bowl. Got it.
Alan, that is an almost painful sound.
It's almost
in this soundproof studio. It almost penetrates right into the inner recess of the ears. It's quite an amazing sound. What did you think of that?
Can you see my hands? No.
It requires your entire body.
It requires the whole of my physical being to play the bowls. I mean, it's all right. Yes, I could give you the bowl, I could give you a stick, Eric, and I could say...
I could make a sound like on a wine glass.
You could make a sound like on a wine glass, but the sound would cut out in a few seconds, and that's it. I mean, I've become an instrumentalist. I've learned how to play the bowls, but it still affects my whole being. And I'm physically and mentally exhausted after playing.
It does exhaust you, does it?
Oh, yeah.
And is this what it is, basically some form of spiritual discipline? I noticed that when you're playing the bowls, your eyes are closed, you're obviously totally concentrated on what you're doing.
Absolutely. I have to be totally concentrated. The moment I lose concentration, the stick loses concentration with the bowl, and then I have to start again. Can you think of any other instrument in which such involvement is needed?
I'd have thought any of the great jazz trumpeters, for example, were in a sense playing themselves as well as the instrument. Remember, Louis Armstrong tells a story that after playing on a radio program, his wife Lil said to him, "Do you realize that you hit a high top C or whatever it was?" And he hadn't realized he'd gone higher than any trumpeter had ever gone before. But I'm sure, playing with total absorption, it came out so easily that he couldn't have done it if he tried consciously.
Yes. That actually brings us round to our human thigh bone, the human femur, which is used for summoning up demons. The amazing thing about these is the very best were taken from the legs of criminals.
Criminals?
Yes, because they were perhaps the closest to the demons. It's played a little bit like a trumpet, but you play it with your tongue and your lips.
Embouchure is the...
Yes, I believe so, right. I will play, in fact, a Tibetan call.
Plaintive, like the bow.
And this is on a criminal's thigh bone.
On a criminal's thigh bone.
Intended to summon up spirits.
I hope they haven't come in this evening.
Listening to you playing, the sound reminded me of the instrument called an onde martino that Messiaen uses in the Turangalila Symphony. Messiaen in the Turangalila Symphony was obviously groping towards the same kind of ritualistic feeling that underlies Tibetan music. Scriabin, the Russian composer, also believed that music combined with colors blending on a screen with perhaps movements of the human body could produce religious ecstasy. In other words, music in itself is capable of building up, is capable of that peculiar build-up towards ecstasy, using these sounds as its foundation. Now, the Westerners approach it from the point of view of building up an intensity, as in the music of Scriabin. The Easterners approach it from the still center, and it seems that neither have succeeded in meeting, so to speak, in the middle. Surely what Messiaen would have loved to do ideally would be to use these Tibetan bowls in his symphonies.
Because in Tibet, these are sound. They're not music. That's one thing I must emphasize. They were never used in a musical setting. These are instruments really for magic ritual.
Perhaps you could take up one of the other bowls now, Alan.
What about the chalice? Yes, looking there about King Arthur's chalice.
Absolutely.
All right.
This is another one of the amazing bowls. This is a speaking and a singing bowl. This bowl caused a great deal of consternation when I actually played this in a temple, because when I discovered that this bowl could speak, and you'll hear it in a moment, it's quite a terrifying sound, the whole assembly, the whole congregation scattered and ran. And then I was told by the Lama that I had no right to have this bowl, that I had no right to have ever taken it out of the country, because what he heard was a mountain demon crying out for his home. Well, it sounds very far-fetched, but I think if you listen, I think you might just hear what they heard. Now, first I'll play you the singing sound. Now the bowl will speak. imagine the psychological impact that must have had on a congregation of credulous people. What has it done to us? You get into a state of abstraction.
Yeah, horrifying sound.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, the bowl that we played, the small, heavy one, the one that reached ear-splitting levels, I have actually broken glass with on many occasions.
It does shatter things.
Well, in fact, it shattered 4 panes in my conservatory one day. I think, in fact, I deafened myself one night. It was a terrifying experience. I was playing it. I wanted to see how long I could hold on to the bowl.
Yes.
Because the vibrations build up to such a pitch that you have to hang on for dear life. And I took it up as far as I could. And when I'd finished, I was stone deaf. I was absolutely terrified, and I didn't hear a thing for nearly 2 hours. I was completely and totally deaf.
I'm convinced that the whole universe, the secret of the universe, is basically vibrations, and that this is what the Tibetans have discovered. Also, the question of how it affects us. Hermann Hesse says somewhere in the bead game that there's an ancient Chinese chord which was forbidden because it was played. It meant the downfall of the state. I believe that this has a basis in reality.
Colin, the classic example are the trumpets and the walls of Jericho.
You see, I think that there's I've approached this thing more or less scientifically. I'm fascinated by the subject. I can feel the peculiarity of these bells, and I feel that there must be a scientific explanation. And the explanation, I think, quite simply, is that the bowls are affecting a part of us, specifically the right cerebral hemisphere of the brain, which is also the key to so-called paranormal experience, supernatural experience. I think, in other words, that it's getting straight through to this part of the brain. Let me be specific about this. The 2 hemispheres of the brain, which is the bit on top that looks like a walnut if you took the top of the skull off,
Yes.
they're divided into 2, and if you split them down the middle, as they do sometimes in brain operations to stop epileptic attacks, you turn literally into 2 different people. If they show you an orange with the left eye and an apple with the right eye, and they say, "What have you just seen?" You reply an apple. If they say, "Write with your left hand what you've just seen," you write orange. If they say, "What have you just written?" you reply apple. You've got 2 different people living in your head. Basically, these 2 halves of the brain are completely separate, but you live in the left half, and that is what you might call the scientific half. The other half of the brain, the half which appreciates music, so that, for example, if a person has right brain damage, a musician, for example, they become completely incapable of appreciating music. You lose all sense of recognition, of pattern recognition, if the right brain is damaged. That's the musical half of the brain. Now, normally, as I'm now talking to you, my words are going into the you, which lives in your left brain, and they're then being processed for general meaning in your right brain. And this is the way we grasp meaning. It has to go in through you in your left brain. Now, what I think is happening with these things is that they're going straight through to the right brain. T.S. Eliot said true poetry can be appreciated before it's understood, meaning that once again it goes straight through to the right brain. Doesn't have to
bypass the left brain entirely.
Bypasses you.
And this gives them the mystical quality which they have, because it's unusual to you to hear this.
This, I think, is the solution.
I'm wondering if we're looking at all these objects in too technical and too scientific a way, missing, perhaps, the wonder of the sound. Because, in fact, no matter how we, as Westerners, look at them, these were originally used to induce deep states of meditation. They were induced to create a state of willing cooperation so that certain dogmatic principles could be laid in the unconscious, almost like post-hypnotic suggestion.
Yes,
and maybe that's all they were for. And maybe in our complicated way of looking at things today, we are ascribing things to these very simple instruments that were never intended in the first place.
I don't agree with you simply because I feel you're not taking it far enough, not in the scientific direction, but in the opposite direction. Now we're moving into strange and very interesting spheres, which I feel the Tibetans knew about, that shamans in general knew about, and that's what this is all about. It's not simply
So what
sound.
you're suggesting is that the psychic content is more important than the sound itself.
I'm convinced of it. I would go so far as to say that if they believed they could summon spirits with certain things, they were probably right.
I have a certain skepticism about what the bowls can do, but I'm still filled with wonder at the mysteries hidden in such simplicity. And Colin is shaking his head. He thinks there's more to it than that.
I do
Maybe
think
I'm
there's
being...
more to it than that.
Well, look, I tell you, when I demonstrate one of the bowls, I must admit I have to suspend all cynicism. I think I'll play it now to give you some idea. This particular bowl is, for me, the most dramatic of all of them. If I had to lose any of the bowls, it could be everyone except this rather large bowl.
This is the largest bowl in the collection.
Yes. I will not say a single solitary thing except that at some stage during this demonstration you will hear a strange knocking sound. And from that knocking sound you'll hear what seems to be hundreds of voices crying out. And these are supposed to be the voices of the poor beings that have fallen off the wheel of life and are plaintively wailing to get back on. I don't think I'd need to say any more, because what you hear is this.
truly extraordinary, that bowl. It leaves you absolutely silent. One can think of nothing to say. I mean, it sounds as if they're not earth-bound sounds at all. They do sound like spirit.
Absolutely the feeling that I
Incredible, don't
have.
you think so, Colin?
It's that whole orchestra, isn't it?
And every time I play them, I am left shaking and filled with the wonder of the whole sound. I agree with you. They do and were intended to raise and invoke some particular phenomena. I don't think we've begun to understand them. I don't think there are very many people, in fact, even among the Tibetans that I've conferred with over the years, who know anything about them at all, because they go back too far, and they were used by a shamanistic sect. We know very little about them. I have the bowls. I've learned as much as I possibly can about them, and I've come up with the conclusions that I know even less about them now than I did when I first discovered them. I found a marvelous book called Through Music to the Self, Peter Michael Hamill, and I find that the very last paragraph in the book says all I would like to say about the bowls, and I quote, "The beauty of drawing and painting can go a long way, but it has its limits. The joy of scents and perfumes goes even further, but music penetrates our innermost depths and thus creates a new life force, a breath of air that lends joy to all existence and leads one's whole being to perfection. Therein lies the fulfillment of human life." Perhaps that explains how I feel about these wondrous instruments.